Welcome, everyone. How are folks feeling this morning? I'm seeing some head nods, some thumbs up, some people still sort of shaking the dampness from the outdoors off. Thank you so much for coming, braving the weather to come join us this morning. My name is Winston Thompson. I'm an associate professor of educational studies, an associate professor of philosophy by courtesy, and I'm a member of the steering committee for the Center for Ethics and Human Values. And it's in that work that I am pleased to serve as the coordinator for the COMPAS series. For those who are not aware, COMPAS stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society. And each year we feature a series of events organized around a single theme, calling to attention and bringing into focus some issues on that theme as we think about what it means to live well with one another. This year is a very special year for us as we're celebrating 10 years of COMPAS programming. So this year's theme is COMPAS Directions, a decade of ethical exploration. Each of the events this year focuses in on one of the themes of a previous year as we revisit that theme, thinking about what has changed, what sort of ethical concerns remain on that subject, and how we might think about the future of these enduringly important issues in our society. I'm very pleased that today you're all here as we're looking back at the theme from 2011-2012, actually the first year of COMPAS programming on immigration. We're joined by a number of wonderful speakers, and I'll, in just a moment, allow my colleague Aaron Yarmel to introduce them. But before I do so, I want to direct your attention to this QR code here in front of you. Those of you who have not yet done so, you might fill out a short survey to ensure that we here at the Center for Ethics and Human Values collect some information that will allow us to serve you better in the future. Okay, you're in for a treat today, and without further ado, I now invite you to welcome my colleague, Associate Director for the Center of Ethics and Human Values, Aaron Yarmel. Aaron?
Thanks, Winston. Thanks so much, Winston. I'm really excited to be here today. I think we're going to have a fantastic panel. The COMPAS events that really get me excited are ones where we're able to take two speakers who are experts in their fields, who come from very different theoretical traditions and can offer different perspectives on a really challenging topic. And I think that today I'm really excited to have Kit Wellman and also Sefa Secen here to do just that. So we're going to be talking about immigration. We're going to be talking about this topic, which is I think one of the most divisive, polarizing, and important topics today. There's huge humanitarian implications of immigration. There's lots of political debates about a variety of different aspects and facets of immigration. A lot of different theoretical frameworks are used to evaluate the goodness and badness of various immigration policies. And so to bring in some experts to kind of walk us through some of these considerations is really important. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our two speakers. So first, we're going to hear from Sefa Secen. So Sefa is currently a postdoctoral scholar at the Marchand Center for International Security Studies at OSU, and he's a research fellow on the Islamic Family Law Project at Syracuse University. He's also a commissioning editor at International Relations. Secen received his PhD in political science from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University in July of 2022. He primarily studies party policies and public attitudes towards refugees with a focus on the social construction of threat and security perceptions. His regional specializations are the Middle East and Western Europe. His co-authored book project, under contract with Cambridge University Press, investigates how the new immigrant and refugee flows have shaped Turkish politics, the historically competing Turkish and Kurdish nationalist visions in particular. Drawing on an original media data set, party manifestos, and survey data, this book offers valuable insights into the complex interactions between refugee politics, electoral dynamics, and the emergence of new political tendencies in Turkey. So I'm really looking forward to that book when it's out. Secen's research has been published or is forthcoming in leading journals and media outlets, including the Journal of Global Security Studies, European Politics and Society, Turkish Studies, Muslim World Journal of Human Rights, Forced Migration Review, the Journal of Privacy and Confidentiality, the Washington Post, and International Relations. His research has been funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, Andrew Berlin Family National Security Research Fund, and the Moynihan Institute at Syracuse University, and the Office of International Affairs, OIA, at OSU. So our second speaker that we're going to hear from is Christopher Kit Wellman. So Kit is a professor of philosophy at Washington University in St. Louis. Wellman works in ethics, specializing in political and legal philosophy. The two topics on which he has written most extensively are our rights to political self-determination, including secession, and our political obligations, especially the duty to obey the law. He is currently working on a variety of practical and theoretical issues related to international law. Wellman is published in a variety of journals, including American Philosophical Quarterly, Ethics, Law and Philosophy, Legal Theory, Pacific Philosophical Quarterly, Philosophy and Public Affairs, Political Theory, Social Philosophy and Policy, and Social Theory and Practice. His books include Debating the Ethics of Immigration, Is There a Right to Exclude, with Philip Cole, A Liberal Theory of International Justice, with Andrew Altman, A Theory of Succession, The Case for Political Self-Determination, and with John Simmons, Is There a Duty to Obey the Law, for Blackwell Publishers. He's edited with R.G. Frey, A Companion to Applied Ethics, and with Andrew Cohen, Contemporary Debates in Applied Ethics. So we're going to hear from Sefa first, then we'll hear from Kit. After that, we'll have a moderated discussion for a little bit, and then we'll conclude with a question and answer period from the audience. So let's do this.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to the event. It's an absolute honor and pleasure to participate in this panel. I want to thank Aaron and the Center for Ethics and Human Values for organizing this panel and inviting me as a panelist. I'm also very happy to be in the company of a great scholar, Professor Wellman. I'm not a political philosopher. I studied the politics of forced migration, but I really look forward to learning about philosophical approaches towards immigrants and refugees. I have tried to familiarize myself with Professor Wellman's extensive body of work. This wasn't an easy task, as he's a prolific scholar and has produced 6 books and numerous articles. Aaron told me that we have about 20 minutes for our initial remarks, so I would like to use this time to provide an overview of when and why states open or close their borders in international relations, and discuss if the states have any legal or moral obligations under the existing international laws to open their borders. At the end of my presentation, I will also highlight a few principles that I believe could guide the creation of a moral regime of human mobility in the 21st century. My overall position on the debate is that a state can choose to close its borders to immigrants, but it cannot deny refugees the right to asylum if it is a party to the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 Protocol. So let me get started. Let me get started by discussing the key principle that guides states' border protection policies in the 21st century in international relations, namely sovereignty. Sovereignty is the foundational principle of modern international relations. Although it is a contested concept and understood in many different ways, in strictly legal terms, it refers to the authority of a state to govern itself, its subjects, and determine its foreign relations. One of the key functions of the state sovereignty is that states can decide who can and who cannot enter their borders. Another consequence of the sovereignty principle is that states primarily view themselves as responsible for providing security, safety, and prosperity for their own constituents or citizens. All of these result in an international system where the legal, economic, and ethical responsibilities of states are highly territorialized. Are there any exceptions to this dominant logic of sovereignty in the modern world? Are there any exceptions, especially to the sovereignty-based exclusion of foreigners by the states? Yes, there are some exceptions to the exclusion of foreigners by the states. Here I would like to discuss 4 of them. First exception is the state's own decisions to bilaterally or multilaterally remove entry restrictions. For example, under the Schengen system, 27 European countries agreed to create common entry and exit requirements and remove internal borders. The agreement allows foreigners to travel freely between participating countries without having to go through border controls. So in this context, state sovereignty is not exercised in the form of a strict border control any longer. Perhaps this partially demonstrates that states' conceptions and exercises of sovereignty may change and do change over time. The second exception to the state's exclusion of foreigners is their own inability to enforce their borders. Not all states are equally well equipped to protect their borders in international relations. A notable example of this is the Syrian-Lebanese border, which I have been to. This border has historically been porous due to both states' limited military capability, allowing individuals to enter and exit somewhat freely. Even when this border is controlled at times, it is not only controlled by the Lebanese army, but also by Hezbollah and other militant groups. Some scholars of international relations describe this situation as a form of limited sovereignty, where a state lacks full control over affairs within some parts of its territory. The third and largest exception to the state's exclusion of foreigners, which is the topic of the day, is immigration. People immigrate in search of work or economic opportunity, to join family, or to study, or for various other reasons. According to the Population Division of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, as of July 2020, the global number of international migrants was estimated to be 281 million. International migrants currently comprise 3.5% of the global population, compared to 2.8% in 2000 and 2.3% in 1980. Apparently, international migration has significantly increased over the last decades. I should note that there are no international laws or norms requiring states to admit immigrants. Immigration is a matter of public policy rather than a matter of global governance for states. States' immigration policies are driven by a wide range of factors. Sometimes they admit those who share an ethnic and religious identity with them in an effort to create a more cohesive nation. Population exchanges between Turkey and Greece after World War I, or between India and Pakistan after the partitioning of British India, or Germany's admission of ethnic Germans from Eastern European countries during the Cold War are just some examples of this type of nationalizing migration. In a sense, modern nation-states are the products of this type of nationalizing migration. Yet today's immigration flows, which are primarily from the global south to the global north, are predominantly motivated by labor market concerns. Some countries in the global north that are confronted with an aging population, low birth rates, and a shrinking labor force selectively admit immigrants to address both their demographic and economic needs. These countries are often well-positioned to attract the brightest and most talented due to the wider life opportunities and chances that they provide to the newcomers. On the other hand, despite the massive outflow of young and talented people, many countries in the global south view immigration as a strategy to alleviate unemployment and increase capital accumulation through remittances. Countries such as the Philippines, Mexico, and India have implemented a wide range of policies to enhance immigration's economic potential. As a result, although the economic benefits of immigration are often asymmetrical or even uneven for sending and receiving countries, they are significant enough to drive and sustain the outflow of immigrants from the global south to the global north. As a parallel process, modern neoliberal states have also developed a tendency to monetize migration flows. The emergence of citizenship by investment schemes illustrates how neoliberal migration states strategically utilize population mobility as a means of generating revenue. For instance, in the US context, one can obtain citizenship by investing $800,000 in a region with a high level of unemployment. Similarly, some countries grant citizenship to those who invest in their economies even as low as $100,000. So the last exception to the state's exclusion of foreigners that I would like to discuss is forced migration, the topic that I study in international relations. Forced migration is a general term that refers to the movements of refugees and internally displaced people, as well as people displaced by natural or human-made disasters across international borders. Among the various groups of forcibly displaced individuals, refugees are the only ones defined and protected under international law. According to the international law on refugees, a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, and violence. To be granted refugee status, people need to cross international borders, enter another country, submit an asylum application, and prove that they have a well-founded fear of persecution and therefore would be unable and unwilling to return to their home country. People seeking asylum at borders are subjected to a criminal background and security check. They must then also navigate a complex and lengthy process of applying for asylum. For instance, the current average wait time for asylum cases in the US is 5 years. So individuals wait for 5 years until they receive a decision on their asylum applications. In cases where the individual's applications and appeals are unsuccessful, they are placed in the removal process and face deportation. The asylum application denial rate exceeds 50% globally, indicating that more often than not, people are denied asylum. While the distinction between immigrants and refugees may not always be as clear as it appears, this distinction serves as the foundation for the entire field of international refugee law. Immigrants typically choose to relocate not due to a direct threat of persecution or death, but primarily to enhance their lives by seeking employment, education, family reunion, or other reasons. Unlike refugees who cannot safely return home, migrants face no such impediment. If they choose to return home, they'll continue to enjoy the protection of their government. Additionally, as I mentioned, countries govern immigration based on their domestic laws and processes. However, when it comes to refugees, there are specific international norms and laws that states must adhere to, which I will discuss in a moment. Finally, unlike immigration, which typically involves movement from the global south to the global north, refugees primarily move within the global south, seeking safety and shelter in neighboring countries. Countries of the global north primarily contribute to global refugee governance through the provision of international aid, which helps with refugees' material needs, but is often perceived as a means to externalize states' obligations under international refugee law. Providing some figures on refugees. As of December 2022, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, there are 29.4 million refugees and 5.4 million asylum seekers worldwide. A substantial majority, 76% of these individuals, are hosted by developing countries. Let me now shift our focus to international refugee law. Seeking asylum is a human right protected under international law. Article 14 of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights highlights that everyone has the right to seek and enjoy asylum from persecution in other countries. The right to asylum was codified and institutionalized by the Refugee Convention of 1951 and its 1967 protocol. The 1951 Refugee Convention provided lasting contributions to the international legal system on refugee rights, including a single universal definition of the term refugee, the core principles of non-discrimination, non-penalization, and non-refoulement. Non-discrimination means that signatory states are required to apply the provisions of the convention without discrimination as to race, religion, and country of origin. Non-penalization means that signatory states cannot impose penalties on asylum seekers based on their illegal entry or presence. Finally, the principle of non-refoulement requires that no one should be returned to a country where they would face torture or inhumane treatment. These principles remain crucial in today's world as well, where an increasing number of people are being displaced due to conflict, violence, and human rights violations. Currently, the great majority of the world's nations, 149 UN member states, are party to the Refugee Convention or its 1967 protocol, while 44 UN members are not. Although this high level of accession to the convention suggests the universal applicability of it, it is also crucial not to draw definitive conclusions about states' compliance or implementation of the convention. Accession to the Convention does not automatically translate into higher admission or better protection of refugees. Notably, some non-signatory states such as Iran, Pakistan, Jordan, and Lebanon host the largest number of refugees globally, while many signatory states implement policies that limit refugees' access to asylum. So this brings me to my next slide on the politics of asylum in international relations. As observed in the state responses to the refugee flows from the Middle East and Africa in 2015, states at times adopt policies that threaten the right to seek asylum. Examples of such policies include intercepting refugee boats before they enter national waters, building fences and walls, and confiscating cash and valuable items from refugees. Intercepting refugee boats before they enter national waters or building fences and walls serve as collective mechanisms to prevent refugees even from applying to asylum. Confiscating their belongings is primarily to deter future refugee arrivals. So there is a widespread practice of criminalizing refugees for crossing international borders. Even after refugees are admitted and resettled, they also confront the limited and selective application of international refugee law by the states. In many cases, states create lesser political subjectivities, such as subsidiary protection, temporary protection, and humanitarian visas to evade their obligations under the Convention and selectively grant asylum to a limited group of individuals. Many studies have revealed how these categories impact the set of rights and services that refugees can access in host countries. For example, with conventional refugee status, refugees usually receive full protection and travel documents without a predetermined expiration date. They also become eligible to apply for family reunification. In contrast, those with subsidiary and temporary protection status are granted only short-term residency and must wait longer before applying for family reunification. And in today's world, a vast majority of refugees actually hold these kind of temporary statuses, temporary protection or subsidiary protection. Another prevalent practice in international relations is the externalization of refugee protection. Externalization refers to the efforts by wealthy developed countries to prevent asylum seekers and other migrants from reaching their borders. These efforts include imposing sanctions on carriers transporting asylum seekers and signing agreements with source and transit countries to prevent asylum seekers from arriving at their borders. A notable example of externalization is the EU-Turkey deal, which was signed in March 2016 at the height of the Syrian refugee crisis. Under the deal, Turkey would take any measures necessary to stop people traveling irregularly from Turkey to the Greek islands. Anyone arriving irregularly on the islands from Turkey would be returned there. For every Syrian returned from the islands, EU member states would accept one Syrian refugee who had been waiting in Turkey to be resettled in a third country. With this, EU countries aim to solely consider the asylum applications of those they selected rather than anyone who arrived at their borders, which constitutes a violation of the Convention's non-discrimination principle. In exchange, the EU promised Turkey €6 billion to be used for improving the humanitarian situation faced by refugees in the country. Consequences of such externalization policies often include increased irregular migration, hosting of refugees primarily for rent-seeking among countries of the Global South, human smuggling, and deaths at the border and sea. Although externalization measures are less visible than physical barriers at international borders, they are often far more effective in controlling and restricting mobility. The last policy that I would like to discuss is the securitization of migrants and refugees. Securitization of refugees refers to presenting them primarily as a security threat, inciting fears of loss of safety on a variety of grounds. Sometimes refugees are depicted as posing an existential threat to the state, sometimes as detrimental to the dominant cultural identity, sometimes as both straining the country's welfare system and aggravating the competition in the low-wage job market. Securitization transforms an ordinary issue into an urgent one and causes a state to suspend its regular practices and policies. States don't hesitate to implement extreme measures when they identify something as a security threat. President Trump's 2017 Muslim ban serves as a notable example of securitization, where Muslim identity was portrayed as a threat to the security and stability of the United States. This portrayal was used as a justification to impose a complete ban on the entry of refugees from these countries. Across Europe, many far-right parties have skillfully tapped into public fears of cultural identity loss, invasion, or replacement by foreigners, and significantly increased their vote shares in recent years. Let me now conclude my presentation by discussing the two principles that I believe should guide the creation of a moral regime of human mobility in international relations. Oh, sorry. First and foremost, I believe in the strict application of the legal distinction between immigrants and refugees. While states may have the right to control and restrict immigration, they don't possess the right to deny individuals the opportunity to apply for asylum, especially if they are parties to the International Refugee Convention or its 1967 protocol. At the very least, states owe refugees a fair and timely evaluation of their asylum applications. I can only envision a few extreme cases where individuals' access to asylum might be restricted for the greater good of the community. First, during public health emergencies, states may temporarily strict border controls to prevent the spread of diseases and protect public health. And in that case, the temporary denial of individuals' right to asylum, would be justified. Second, if refugee movements openly lead to the illegal transfer of weapons across international borders, it could be justified to introduce restrictions on refugee entries, which would also be considered a disqualifying factor under the convention. So these are situations where, militants trying to seek refuge in a place with their weapons. So these are very exceptional situations in international relations. So my justification for immigration restrictions is grounded in two simple factors. First, states have political functions to fulfill, and they bear primary responsibility for enhancing the social and economic rights of their own constituents. Second, states operate with finite resources and cannot provide economic opportunities for more than a certain number of people. There is often an abstract threshold. So I guess states could justify excluding immigrants by highlighting that, that threshold is being exceeded. Contrarily, my justification for imposing no restrictions on refugees' right to asylum is embedded in a hierarchical conception of human rights, where the right to life and freedom from persecution take precedence over social and economic rights. Essentially, states cannot justify excluding individuals with a well-founded fear of persecution based on potential impacts on personal prosperity, such as the number of iPhones, cars, and houses that their citizens can enjoy. The right to life of others outweighs our right to economic prosperity as citizens. As I discussed, the only exceptional cases would be those where admitting refugees involves a real practical choice between the lives of refugees and the lives of native citizens or constituents, which could arise only in public health emergencies or cases involving the actual movement of weapons across international borders. Only in such instances a state would be justified in prioritizing the lives of its own constituents over the lives of refugees. Overall, the principle that I'm putting forward here is that differential responsibilities of states towards citizens and foreigners should not undermine the sanctity of life and right to asylum. In other words, a state cannot use the advancement of the social and economic rights of its constituents as an excuse to deny individuals the right to asylum and freedom from persecution. Okay, with that, I complete my presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for inviting me. It's my first time to Ohio State. I'm delighted to be here. And I'm delighted to get to join the discussion on what I think is a very important topic. There are some people who advocate for closing borders and think that allowing immigrants in would be problematic or detrimental. I'm not among them. I'm not an advocate for closing borders. I actually think that the world would be a better place if most borders were more porous. But I am an unapologetic defender of a legitimate state's right to design and enforce its own border policy. And that means that if a legitimate state wants to, it can decide whom to let in, and it can decide if it wants to let nobody in. That's morally permissible. So my position's a little more nuanced than that, but for the purposes of painting a stark picture so we can have a lot of fun in the Q&A, I'll pitch that at you. So why do I think that states have a right, legitimate states have a right to design and enforce their own border policies? It depends upon three core premises. The first is, I believe legitimate states have a right to political self-determination. The second is that I think freedom of association is an integral component of self-determination, so that if you don't have the right to freedom of association, you're not fully self-determining. And the third is that freedom of association necessarily includes the right to refuse to associate with potential associates. So I think all of these are plausible. I think the second and third premises are relatively uncontroversial, and the first one is probably the most controversial. So let me try and quickly motivate the second and third claims, and then I'll spend a little bit more time talking about the first. So why do I believe that you're not fully self-determining unless you have freedom of association, and importantly, that freedom of association includes the right not to associate if you don't want to? Take yourselves. Imagine that you didn't get to choose whether and with whom to be married. Imagine that your parents got to choose your marital partner. Maybe your father decides who you're going to marry, when you're going to marry. In my case, my father is he passed away a couple years ago, was much wiser than I. And I'm not denying that he might be able to make a better choice and that I might have had a better life and been happier if he had chosen. But I am denying that I would be self-determining if I didn't get to choose, if I didn't get to veto. If he said, you know, this young woman or this young lad is somebody, Kit, that I think you should marry, and you have to marry him, right? There'd be a very important sense in which I wasn't the author of my own life. And most of us think that this is impermissible because it should be Kit's call whether or not to marry someone who in turn is willing to marry Kit. And if Kit doesn't want to marry anyone, he doesn't have to marry anyone, okay? So I want to say, similarly, legitimate states can decide whom, if anyone, they want to invite into their political community. So if somebody wants to join their political community, they might say, sure, we'd like you to join. And they might say, no, we don't want you to join. Or we might say, we want some of you, not others. They might say, no, we don't want any of you. So some people worry about this analogy and they think, well, sure, autonomous adults are entitled to self-determination, but it's not so clear that states are. But I think that it's a pretty plausible premise. So think about Norway. So in my view, a state is legitimate if it satisfactorily protects the human rights of its constituents and respects the rights of everybody. So I think that states could be, there are states like Norway, which are paradigmatically legitimate because they do a satisfactory job of protecting human rights. States like North Korea are illegitimate. They're sort of paradigm rogue state because they are unwilling to respect human rights. And then states like Somalia are illegitimate because they're failed states. Maybe they're willing to, but they're unable to satisfactorily protect the human rights of their constituents. So my view is only about legitimate states, like Norway. So as some of you know, Norway in 1905 politically divorced Sweden. So there was a secession and Norway was independent. Imagine Sweden looked at the reunification of Germany and said, wow, things are working out really well in Germany. We should get back together with Norway, right? And it's fine if Sweden wants to say to Norway, hey, you want to get back together? And then it's Norway's call whether they want to or not. But if Norway doesn't want to, it would be impermissible for Sweden to forcibly annex Norway, right? And the way to explain that is that Norway is entitled to its self-determination. And if it doesn't want to associate with Sweden that way, it doesn't have to, okay? Or think about the European Union. The European Union would love for Norway to join as a full member. And twice Norwegians have held plebiscites to decide whether or not to do so. And in my view, that's the right call, that the Norwegians should have a plebiscite, and twice they've decided they didn't want to join. Now imagine that the European Union would function much better if Norway were a part of it. And imagine that Norway would function better for Norwegians if they were part of the European Union. Even so, I think it's their call. Just as my father might be able to pick out a better marital partner than I could pick out, it's my call to make. And I think it's Norway's call to make whether or not it wants to be part of the European Union or whether it wants to merge with Sweden. And I say the similar thing about Swedes. So if you go to Oslo in the summer and you go to a cafe or a bar, it's very likely the guest worker is going to be serving you. And it's likely going to be a young Swede because the economy in Norway, largely because of North Sea oil, is so much better than in Sweden that young Swedes go to Norway for the summers to work in their bars and cafes and such. Now imagine that some of these Swedes say, hey, we want to stay, we want to immigrate, we don't want to just come here as a guest worker, we want to stay here permanently, we want to be part of your political community. Just as I think Norway is entitled to tell Sweden, no thank you, we don't want to merge with you, I think Norway as a whole is entitled to say to any individual Swede or any other prospective immigrant, yes, you may join our political community, or no, you may not, okay? So I just think the right to political self-determination, once you appreciate that freedom of association is a component of that, explains why a legitimate state like Norway stands in a privileged position of dominion regarding its own political community, and it gets to decide whether or not it wants to allow other people who want to join the community in. Okay. It's important to appreciate that while I think that's a right, I'm not an absolutist about this or anything else. I think this is a presumptive right, and it's could be potentially be defeated, right? And what you might do is you might look around the world and say, okay, self-determination and political self-determination is important, but it's not the only thing. The status quo is a moral abomination, right? There's horrific injustice because in Chad, for instance, there are so few economic opportunities, and in Norway there are so many. And Norwegians didn't do anything fancy or special in utero to deserve to be born into a Norwegian environment where there are just spectacular life prospects. And similarly, the Chadians didn't do anything to deserve to be born in a situation where their life prospects are so bleak, right? And so Chadians might want to move to Norway in order to have better life prospects. And they can't because there's a line on a map and there are guns pointing toward the outside saying you can't come in. And so that just seems unjust that for sort of morally arbitrary reasons, it looks like the Norwegians have all these opportunities and the Chadians have so few, right? And so you'd say whatever rights to political self-determination the Norwegians have, they're outweighed because of international injustice. All right, so I'm among those who thinks the status quo is in fact not defensible. But notice there are two ways you can go here, right? One is you can open the borders if you want and allow people to move to where the opportunities are. But if Norway decides it doesn't want to do that, it could also move opportunities to where the people are. And this is how we handle things domestically, right? So Jeff Bezos has a lot more money than I, right? And we don't think that I get to join his family, right? Because he's got so much more money than I. Instead, we say, well, as long as Bezos is doing his, fulfilling his duties of distributive justice and transferring whatever justice requires to his fellow citizens, then he retains the right to freedom of association, and he doesn't have to associate with Kit as a family member, right? So if that seems this commonsensical way of how we handle inequalities domestically, why not do so globally, right? And if we decide, for instance, that it is in fact unjust and the Norwegians can't allow the status quo without addressing it, it's not clear that the way they treat this injustice has to be in the currency of open borders. If they want to open the borders, fine. right? But if they want to jealously protect their political community, then they have to help people where they are. All right, so that seems to me a plausible solution. But you might say, okay, fine if we're talking about global justice in general, right? Because it's easy to export things. Actually, not easy, but it seems plausible to export things. But surely refugees are an exceptional case, right? So we saw in the excellent discussion earlier that we want to make a distinction for refugees. These are people who are being persecuted, or if you take a more expansive account of refugees, their human rights are vulnerable for some other reason, and it looks like they can only be helped by being admitted into the political community. And I want to deny that again. I want to affirm that each country has to do its fair share to help people who are imperiled around the world, but it's not clear that even in the case of refugees, this assistance has to come in the case of open borders. So I live in St. Louis. I flew up from St. Louis last night. The largest Bosnian population is in Bosnia. The second largest Bosnian population is in St. Louis. And that's because the United States, there was a refugee crisis, and the United States says we have some really good potential neighborhoods in St. Louis. Come to the United States, we'll relocate you in St. Louis. And so I think the United States is the better for it. I think that St. Louis is the better for it. I think that was great. I have no objections to that, okay? But it's important to appreciate that's not the only way you can help people who need refuge. There's another case before the 2003 US-led incursion into Iraq where there was credible evidence that Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist regime was going to perpetrate genocide on the Kurds in northern Iraq. And in that case, the United States didn't say to the Kurds, come here, we're going to take you and move you to St. Louis. Instead, they said, we're going to create a safe haven for you in northern Iraq. And what that meant is that the United States, among others, instituted a no-fly zone to make sure that the Kurds had refuge where they lived, right? So I think that it seems plausible to suggest that refugees have a right to refuge, but that's very different than saying that they have a right to move to another country or the country of their choice. And I'll just say a couple, I'm mindful of going over my time here, but I'll say a couple things. My own view is that the affluent, privileged, developed states have to do their share, but they have a choice as to the currency in which they fulfill those duties of distributive justice, even to refugees. You might take it one step further, though, and you might think, other things being equal, it's better to help people where they are, right? So everybody that I think is informed and morally sensible thinks that the status quo is unjust, right? But there might actually be advantages to moving the opportunities to where the people desperately need them rather than moving desperate people to where the opportunities are more plentiful. And that's for a couple reasons. One is, most obviously, other things being equal, people prefer to stay in their homelands, right? People are willing to sacrifice an enormous amount because the difference in opportunities are so stark, but other things being equal, they would like to stay where they are in their homelands. The other thing is that, and this is a point that David Miller, among others, have emphasized, that when you open borders, what tends to happen is that the very best among the global poor are able to take advantage of that, right? So the doctors, the engineers, the nurses have the means to move from Chad to Norway. And then what happens is the Chadians who don't have the resources to move are even worse off, right? Because now they lack the compatriots they would have had who've left for what they presume to be greener pastures. And so if you're really worried about the worst off, then you want to try and help people where they are rather than open borders. And finally, it seems to me that the real reason that life is so good in the United States or in Norway or Canada or New Zealand is because of the institutions, right? And so what we need to do is we need to see that other countries which have such poor institutions, whether they be Somalia or North Korea or Chad, right, that those institutions are fortified. And one of the biggest problems with opening your borders and having Chadian doctors and nurses and engineers leave is those are precisely the people who are going to be most equipped to build the types of institutions that Chadians are going to need in the future. So I think the long term, there's a very plausible case that long term the best solution is going to be less opening borders and more trying to help people where they are. Thank you.
Awesome. So thank you both of you. I really enjoyed both these presentations. So I'll start with you, Kit. So your basic moral foundation that you're using for this this discussion is a deontological foundation, but it's in the style of like Sir William David Ross. It's one where we have presumptive rights. So it's a right to exclude, but it's a right that can be outweighed. There can be some cases where other considerations are just so weighty that they're more stringent than this right to exclude. And when I interact with Rossians, I know better than to ask for like an algorithm for determining when something is more stringent than something else, because that's just not part of the foundation. But what I do find it helpful is to hear a couple of paradigm cases so that I can understand what it looks like when it actually does get outweighed. So could you give a couple of cases in as much detail as you want where it's just absolutely clear that the right to exclude has been like outweighed by another more stringent value, and where it would be wrong for a state to exclude somebody?
Sure. Let me give you three cases that I would contrast. So the first is you've got a philosophy professor at the University of Toronto who desperately wants to be on the faculty at Ohio State. And she can't come to Ohio State unless she's given permission by the United States. And so I think that is a case where she does not have a right. She might really rather be at Ohio State than Toronto for a variety of reasons that I don't have to explain those to you. But that would be a case where though her life would be better, she has an interest, she doesn't have a right to, and the United States' right to political self-determination would explain why they could deny her admission. When human rights are at play, then I think it fetishizes self-determination if you say that we're going to allow self-determination to trump someone's human rights. So if someone in Toronto is going to die unless she can get into the United States, then I'm not going to side with the United States. What I tried to emphasize in my opening remarks, though, is that there, in many cases, our duties to outsiders are disjunctive, which is say either we have to allow them to come here where they can be helped, or we have to make sure they're helped where they are or somewhere else. And so a lot of cases that look like of outsiders look like that might give them a right to immigrate don't, because there are other ways we can help them. The last case where I do think an outsider has the most compelling reason to get in would be family reunification. Okay? So this is a case. Notice that if I assert that the country as a whole gets to say of any given prospective immigrant whether she can immigrate or not, then I'm allowing the country freedom of association, but I'm denying each citizen that she's got dominion over with whom she associates, right? So imagine that somebody on the faculty here at Ohio State has a daughter in Toronto, right? I think that daughter's claim to come in is weightier, and I think it can't be discharged in other ways as easily. So that's a case where I would make an exception to my general presumption that the state gets to decide.
Got it. So for family reunification, the state, the interest that the daughter has of reunifying with her mother who's come over here is weightier than the state's interest in the right to exclude. In the second example, I just want to make sure, for the second example, it's a disjunctive duty. If the other disjuncts can't be discharged, then somebody seeking asylum for humanitarian reasons has a right that outweighs the right to exclude. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll just to highlight a contrast between Sefa and me. So I think that I think we would both say that if human rights are in play, that there's a duty. My own sense is that what countries have to do is they have a duty to allow the person in if it's not unreasonably costly. And based on Sefa's comments, we may draw the line about what's unreasonably costly at different places. I would agree with him that maybe if we have a few fewer iPhones, that's not unreasonably costly. But if I understood Sefa correctly, he was saying as long as the lives of our compatriots aren't going to be sacrificed, then it's not weighty enough for human rights. So I think, I believe there are positive duties and corresponding positive rights, but I think I might be a little bit more generous about where I drew the line in terms of unreasonably costly.
Do you want to actually respond to that? So I'm curious whether you do draw the line in a different place in terms of unreasonable cost than Kit does. If you want to use the mic.
So of course, yeah, like I kind of separate between kind of social economic rights and very essential rights to life and freedom from persecution. So I'm using a hierarchy of rights, and any type of other rights would not be superseded over the right to life and freedom from persecution. So, yeah.
And I'm really curious about that. And I want to kind of push on that for a little bit. So imagine that there's just devastating economic consequences that come from a proposed change in an asylum policy that would open up borders quite a lot. So we're not just talking about fewer iPhones for citizens. We might be talking about, I'm not exactly sure what it might look like.
For example, people not having kind of enough housing because of the refugee flows,
sure,
or
yes,
not having enough food. Perhaps, in those cases, I guess, the choice would be between the lives of, constituents, citizens, and the lives of refugees. So if we face a clear case where, admitting one more refugee would really cost the life of one kind of citizen because they would lack access to food and shelter, they would freeze outside, then you can definitely make a case that the exclusion is justified. So even in that case, whose life is more important, given the fact that states have primarily responsibilities towards their citizens, they would be justified to prioritize the lives of their citizens over the lives of foreigners.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So I guess what you're saying is that there's certain economic costs that could justify exclusions. You're saying that the economic costs can only justify exclusions when they actually amount to threats to life.
Yeah, exactly.
In the state. And so you're still prioritizing this hierarchy of rights.
Rights,
I think you're prioritizing kind of, basically rights to receive the basic requirements for survival.
Rights, minimum rights needed for a decent life, I guess. Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, cool. Excellent. I want to ask another follow-up, or another kind of clarifying question. So you're very clear that the right to exclude extends to refugees as well. And what I'm wondering about is what's wrong with making the following claim? What does this particular claim get wrong? In any case where you have somebody coming from a failed state where their life is at risk, the speed with which you'd be able to impose institutional reform in that state, or the difficulty of coercing a failed government to respect the basic rights of its citizens are so significant that that person's not going to survive if you don't let them in. The cost to your own state is going to be significant. And our track record of exporting democracy just isn't that great. If I think about what we tried in Afghanistan, it didn't really work out that well. And so what I wonder about is what's wrong with thinking that in any case where you have somebody seeking asylum from a failed state, a country ought to let them in, and that the right to exclude has been outweighed simply because of the practical difficulties with respecting that individual's right?
Excuse me. I'll say two things. First, absolutely, our historical track record of helping people where they are is a textbook for cynics. But what's our historical track record of allowing people to immigrate and helping them become full-fledged citizens where we are? Equally grim. So I think that it's true that what we've done has not worked to this point. But it's not clear. I would push back on your idea that there's this obvious, easy solution, which we don't have. Second point is if you're correct, and I'll just stipulate. Let's say there's a situation where we cannot help people where they are fast enough, and those individuals will die. Right? Then we have to get them out. But if we can get them out, and 6 months later we can return them because we fixed the situation so that they now have refuge in their homeland. In my view, there's nothing wrong with temporary resettlement, which is very different from immigration, where you allow someone in and allow them to stay. Now, again, I've got no problem if a country like the United States with the Bosnians says, come and stay. But if a legitimate state says, no, what we're going to do is we're going to house you here temporarily, and then we're going to insist that you go back when things are okay, then I've got no problem with that. And I'll say two other things. I'm sorry I'm going on such length. One is, that's what we sort of do, or we claim we're doing, and people are spending years and years. They're growing up, they're spending their whole lives in horrific refugee camps. So please don't understand me to be justifying what we're in fact doing now. But I will give the case. Look at what Poland did with Ukraine, right? You had all these Ukrainians fleeing to Poland, and what Poland said is, come, you're good, no questions asked for 3 years, and then we'll figure it out. And I got no problem with Poland doing it. I think Poland's to be applauded for the way they welcomed people who desperately need it, and I would have no problem if the Polish people, if the horrific situation in Ukraine improves in the relatively near future, right? If the Poles said, okay, we were happy to help you, but we don't want you part of our political community, we're going to force you to go back. I got no problem with that. I would have a problem if people stayed for 30 years and then the Polish said, but now you got to go back.
Okay, that's fascinating. I'm wondering, Sefa, what are your
I have
thoughts
actually a couple of questions
Do it.
for
Yeah,
Kit.
rock and roll.
Would you mind?
Yeah, do it.
So, okay. So I was actually curious to hear more about your conception of membership in a political community. So one of the reasons why you think that states could justify exclusion of immigrants and refugees is that, like, they have a right to choose who's going to be a part of the political community, right? So, but I feel that that's a very expansive understanding of political community, especially in regards to kind of refugees and immigrants, because like most of the refugees and immigrants don't become citizens. They can't vote, they can't run for offices. So, and in some cases, they're kind of, they are actually reduced to sheer physical existence, in a space. So, and I was wondering how actually, excluding or including immigrants and refugees would necessarily, pose the risk of extending the political community, because these individuals don't have political rights necessarily. Even the convention does not require the states to provide political rights to refugees. So, that's my first question. If you,
So that's a great question, because it forces me to explain that there's an implicit premise in my argument. And if you reject this implicit premise, then my argument doesn't work. And the implicit premise is that it's morally impermissible to have second-class citizens who don't have full rights, okay? So if a professor visits for one semester from Toronto to Ohio State, I don't think she needs to be given citizenship. I think there's nothing objectionable about someone being here for 6 months and not being given full rights of citizenship. But if someone moves from Toronto indefinitely and she lives here and this is where her life is, I think it's impermissible to say you're part of this community, but you don't have the same say that the rest of us do, right? And so that is why, in my view, immigration, as opposed to temporary movement, immigration requires full inclusion in the political community. And so if people are allowing refugees to come for decades but not giving them full citizenship right, I think that's impermissible.
Okay, I would definitely agree with that. But the existing practice in international relations, immigrants and refugees do not really easily become citizens, even over decades. And like another kind of related thing that I wanted to highlight in relation to that, like states have developed the practice of granting citizenship based on investment. And citizenship, if you're thinking of citizenship as the means to kind of political rights, like it seems that states are not really obsessed with who that person is, from which background they come, as long as they provide, a financial support to the state, they could be included and become also political members of the nation state. So I'm feeling that nation states do not, especially neoliberal nation states, do not put a lot of emphasis on the uniqueness of political membership in a society, because membership has become a commodity as well in some ways. So if you want to respond to that, I would be happy to hear your response, but otherwise I have other questions. But
okay, so I'll say a couple things. Sure. One is that, and this is the most important thing, I suspect that you and I probably disagree in the margins, right? So for instance, I think the duty to help others, there's a positive duty to help others, but I think it's, for me, less demanding than it is for you. But I think that you and I largely agree, and we would join in unison in condemning much of what current states do. So don't think that because I defend the rights of legitimate states to close their borders if they satisfactorily discharge their duties of international distributive justice in other ways, that I'm therefore on the hook for everything that all existing neoliberal states do. I don't know what neoliberal is, but I'm pretty sure when people like you use it, it means boo. Okay, so I shouldn't be on the hook for that. Okay, but I'll also say this. It doesn't seem to me necessarily wrong if a state says, we're going to allow rich folk, right? So, like, I want your hand in marriage, and you're like, not if you're going to be a philosopher, right? You just don't make enough money, right? And then I'm willing to change professions. I go to Wall Street, and you're like, okay, now I'll marry you. Now, are you the most virtuous person? No, because you should support philosophers. But you're within your rights. You're within your rights to say, I don't want a life with a philosopher, right? I want to have a good life and to reject. And so if you had two suitors, one of whom was wealthier than another, you'd be within your rights to take the wealthier suitor. Similarly, if a country has multiple prospective immigrants and they want to choose some people because they could assimilate better because they speak the language, or they would fit into the economy better, or because they have more money, that's their call to make.
So political membership in a community is not kind of a virtuous kind of concept, right? So like, it can be interpreted in many ways by the nation states, right? It can be kind of interpreted as in the example that you kind of discussed. So it's, if your suitor is a rich person and if that's what you want in life, that's okay. If a nation state thinks that wealth is the most important thing, then it can grant citizenship based on wealth. Okay?
This is good. So I want to, just in the interest of time, I want to make sure that we can dig into your foundations a little bit as well.
Yeah, so
far, this has been the easiest moderated panel I've ever done. But so thank you. So Mike, I want to ask you a question just about kind of the basic foundational moral claim you made, which is that a right to life and freedom trumps social and economic rights. I'm wondering if you think that applies not just to nation states, but that applies kind of more broadly to the interactions between humans. Because if it does, that's a really significant revision to our moral code. That would mean that your rights to all sorts of property might get trumped by somebody else's right to the benefits that they could get from those things. So I'm wondering if you could respond to what I take to be a pretty radical implication of that view.
Now, I guess, yeah, I'm gonna use the microphone. So I think in practice, this is a theory. You guys are political philosophers. I guess, political philosophies do not necessarily have to apply to reality, right? But, as someone who studies political science, I always think about, practicality of things. In real life, I guess we would run into serious problems in terms of how one clearly distinguishes between social and economic rights and, these highest rights, right to life and right to, freedom from persecution. The cases of refugees are clear because, these are the individuals who are really fleeing persecution, and the states have a right and authority to evaluate their kind of claims to that status. But for, I guess, for other life situations, it could not, perhaps, thinking of the relationship between the global south and global north, would this require a type of distributive justice between, different countries? Or would this require a type of distributive justice within, societies? How that would look like. So yeah, those are kind of broad questions to be entertained. But in case of refugees, I guess there is definitely a clear case that we can see the kind of tensions between different categories of rights. Especially when people talk about why they oppose immigration or refugees, they tend to bring up economic and social rights, right? Because we want to protect our culture or we want to protect our kind of economy because refugees are gonna put a strain on our welfare system, right? So, yeah, and when refugees talk about their lives and their stories, they talk about, okay, I faced this, I faced that, I need to flee, I need to protect my life and all of that. I see those things as things having different level of importance, and in case of human rights, different categories of human rights.
Okay, so I want to make sure I'm understanding.
Yeah.
First, I think that we do want our theories to apply to the real world, and part of why
said if it doesn't apply, that doesn't mean that the theory is not a good theory. So that's what. Yeah.
But I think we might even push back on that. I think what I take to be so valuable about the contributions that you raised and kind of the lessons that I've learned from reading your body of work is that it's pushed me to challenge whether I hold all the political theoretical beliefs that I had when I went into it. So when I read your work about family reunification, for example, it's helped me have all sorts of really juicy real world examples against which I can test my theories and see whether I actually hold them. And so I think the reason why I'm asking about whether you endorse this hierarchy of rights with respect to a lot of examples, rather than just with respect to the conditions of refugees versus states, is just to understand how broad this theory is. And so if what you're thinking about is, in the case of refugees in particular, we shouldn't weigh the economic interests over the interest in having a basic, the conditions of life, then what I would be curious to know is that because in general, a right to life outweighs a right to economic security or a right to my property? Or is it just that in the special case of refugees that applies, but in general you're not endorsing that hierarchy of values? Does that question make sense?
So I haven't thought a lot about this, but I guess we could think of different examples. For example, we could raise the question of if, let's say, somebody is facing a life-threatening situation, can they trespass on someone's private property? If you kind of don't adopt a hierarchy of rights, you could say that the right to property is equally valuable. So and this individual has no justification to trespass on private property. But if you're kind of adopting this hierarchy of rights, you could say that the right to life comes before the right to property, and this person is justified to trespass on private property. So I guess we can definitely think of different examples where we could apply a hierarchy of rights and justify different kinds of behaviors.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm going to shift just to the audience Q&A. So no, thank you for that. That was really interesting. I think if we had more time, we could dig really much more deeply into how we understand hierarchies of rights, how it might be similar or different from kind of whether you're thinking about the stringency of different rights. But I want to open it up to the audience.
Kit, this question is for you. So you were talking about when a state can decide, and so I'm wondering what makes a state's decision legitimate. So is it a fair procedure? Would a simple majority make the state's decision legitimate? And then I'm especially wondering about that because it seemed like when you talked about family reunification in response to Aaron's question, it seemed like you wanted to prioritize individual rights of self-determination over a state's rights to self-determination. And if that's true, then I wonder what happens when there's a lot of disagreement within the state, but just like it happens to be a simple majority wants to go one way or the other.
Yeah, so for me, I would just go with standard democratic practice, right? So I think there were a lot of Norwegians that wanted to join the European Union, but if 51% chose not to, then the 49% lose and the group as a whole decides. And so that is going to be how leaders are elected. That's going to be how Norway decides whether it wants to reunite with Sweden. It's going to be how Norway decides whether it wants to join the Union, and it's going to be how Norway decides whether or not to allow any prospective immigrant in. And so some individuals are going to lose. But you're right, there's some rights that we don't, there are some individual rights that are protected against democratic decision-making, right? So even if the majority wants to enslave certain people, they don't get to do so if they want to do certain things. So individual rights are, I think, trump or prevail against some democratic processes, but those things that are legitimately the group's decision to make are just made in terms of a simple majority.
I also have questions for Kit. So this is kind of like a hypothetical. Say you had country A, and they were like totally responsible for creating the conditions in country B that would result in like a refugee crisis. Do you think that alters country A's or influences country A's right to exclude them from like immigrating here at all?
Absolutely. So, first of all, it certainly impacts their duties of distributive justice, right? So I talked about Norwegians and Chadians, right? Now let's imagine the reason why Chadians have such poor institutions is because Norway was there like 80 years ago mucking things up, right? And so it's not just that the Norwegians happen to, either through the grace of God or because of their hard work, put together some really good institutions, but the Chadians are currently imperiled because of what Norwegians have done. So absolutely, Norway's going to be on the hook for helping the Chadians in a way that, Canadians are not, okay? But I'm going to go back to this. It's less clear to me, and I don't want to commit to this, but it's less clear to me that those aren't duties of distributive justice, those are duties of reparative justice, have to come in the form of open borders, right? So if the Norwegians can fully repair the Chadians, the damage done to the Chadians that they've done by helping them in Chad, then I'm fine with that. But if they can't, then the Norwegians don't get to invoke their right to political self-determination because they forfeited that right when they mistreated the Chadians.
Okay, I have a question that hopefully will extend to both of you, but it springs from comments that both of you provided. So Kit, I want to pose this to you, but I'd love to hear your insight on
You go first.
The dynamic between Turkey being sort of asked to take in a variety of immigrants and migrants because the other legitimate states that might have sort of distributive duties to do so are kind of outsourcing that to Turkey. And using the framework that you provided, Kit, about a legitimate state being one that recognizes the human rights of all of their constituents, I have questions about the legitimacy of Turkey as a state. So I'm wondering what you would say about this sort of like, rather than perhaps the EU having like upholding their distributive duties or duties of distributive justice to work with immigrants, say in Tunisia or in Chad, to improve those institutions, is like having or working with Turkey to rehouse and host those migrants like sufficient in meeting their distributive justice duties, or is in working with a potentially illegitimate state where they won't actually have the full, perhaps, human rights that they would, like, or they're like better off, but it's definitely not like the extent to which they would be recognized within the, like, a legitimate country's hosting or whatever? Does that work, or should we still have questions about the sort of like legitimate state, maybe like questionably legitimate state partnership as a means of distributive justice, like, duties?
So I guess that question is for you, but I can offer just a small
If
comment.
If you've got, I want you to go first if you've got something to say.
Okay, so
I
thank you so
definitely got
much.
stuff to
Yeah,
say.
Okay, perfect. I can feel it. Yeah. So I feel that, like, applying this legitimate versus illegitimate state logic to international relations would create a lot of ethical issues around foreign policy, right? So I guess if we were to kind of like, create a list of legitimate states in international relations, that wouldn't have more than 5-6 states. So if our only concern is that, these states respect basic human rights and they do not create refugees, right? So even there are individuals actually who sought refuge or asylum in foreign countries, like Edward Snowden, right? You can think of it as an exceptional case, but there are individuals who think that they actually experienced human rights violations and sought refuge in other countries, right? So, and if we really apply that legitimate and illegitimate state logic to international relations, we would have a situation where, like, there would be a lot of ethical issues around foreign policy. And although, I agree that, states should not kind of, if they adopt the same principle, maybe, I'm not sure if Kit goes as far as telling that, like, legitimate states should not even interact with illegitimate states in in international relations, or it's just a legal categorization. But the so-called legitimate states in international relations don't go that way. They try to externalize immigration, refugee protection, and all of it. So that's what I could offer. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to say some things. This is a trigger warning because I'm probably say all kinds of inappropriate things here. So you and I live out in a really remote area of Alaska, right? Nobody around, nothing. And we're neighbors, and we both come out of our house because we hear a baby crying. And someone's just left a baby, and we can't figure it out. And there's a baby there, right? And there's no orphanage anywhere, right? So who's going to take this baby, right? So neither of us really wants to take the baby, right? I'm like, well, I could take the baby, and you're like, well, I don't want to take the baby, but it doesn't seem fair. I got to take the baby, and you don't, right? So why should I have to take the baby? And you say, look, I'm willing to do my share, right? But I just don't want a baby. So what you do is you say, I'm going to work harder, and I will give you money if you take the baby. I got no problem with that. Right? So, you're contributing by giving me money so that I have to work less hard doing other things so I can spend more time raising this baby. Okay, not an issue with that. But it turns out the reason, and this is the trigger warning, the reason why I'm out in some remote area of Alaska is because I am a child molester, right? And I know I got to go away from children. Right? Because I know I'm going to be tempted, so I want to go out in the middle of nowhere. Now, is it okay for you to say, I don't want a baby, Kit, you raise this baby, and you know that I'm a child molester? No, right? Okay, so in that case, I think it wouldn't be cool for you to say, I don't want to raise a baby. I'm just going to outsource this to Kit, right? Because you're putting the baby in a situation in which she would be perilous. But let's come back from that a little bit to your thing, right? Who would be a better parent, me or you? You, of course, right? I wouldn't be. You'd be the best parent in the world. I'd be an okay parent, not as good a parent as you, right? But I'd be a satisfactory parent. In that case, is it okay for you to say, Kit, you raise the baby. I'll give you the extra money because I really don't want a baby, right? I want to focus on doing political philosophy and babies get in the way, right? And is it okay, even though you know that I would do an imperfect job raising the baby? In my view, yes. Okay, so I think it's perfectly analogous. If there are refugees, and let's just stipulate that the European Union does a really spectacular job protecting the human rights of all its denizens. Turkey, not a child molester, but less so, but satisfactory. If those are the circumstances, then I've got no problem with the EU saying, we'll give you, what was the number? $6 billion to help you take these folks in, right? And you're going to discharge that.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. We have 1 minute left. And so if you have I saw you had your hand up earlier. If you have a really quick question.
No, the last response sort of answered my question.
Oh, did? Okay, cool. Yeah, we're probably about 30 seconds left. So I think what I'll do is use this time to thank our speakers. I really enjoyed your presentations. The discussion that we just had was fantastic. Learned a lot of things. I'd like to thank our audience. Thank you so much for your questions. And yeah, well, have a great day, everyone.
Thank you all. That was fun. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.